Here we are at the end of the Memorial Day weekend in the Fairhope Public Library, and we are participating in the Veterans History Project. It's very similar to the one in Washington, D.C. at the History Library of Congress, and you will get a copy of this recording to keep for yourselves. And the other copy would be going to the official record in Washington. We'd like to keep this flowing and natural. I'm not going to interrupt very often. I may prompt you a little bit from time to time, but mostly it's going to be just a chronology of everything that happened to you as a World War II veteran, both before and after. And to lead off with a discussion, if you could tell us a little bit about where you were born and raised, and any siblings, and what your father and mother were engaged in. I know we've already talked about a little bit about it, sure, but this is for the record.
Okay.
So it's all yours. Glenn Boone.
Well, I was born in Sacramento, California in 1926, and in Sutter Hospital, overlooking Sutter Fort in Sacramento. Mother was a school teacher, first and second grade, and my father was working on the railroad at that time as a fireman, going over the Sierra Nevada mountains. And I was raised in Wheatland, in the Roseville area where they were living at the time. Mother 6 years later became my first and second grade school teacher, which was a challenge. And at that time, by the time I was in school, there were problems with my grandfather who died, and so Dad stayed with the railroad. Mom continued teaching, but he also started helping my grandmother operate the farm. And we moved subsequently from the house that my other grandfather had built for Mom and Dad to a little town called Wheatland. Mm-hmm. Growing up in there, by the time World War II came, it was 11 boys and 1 girl in my high school graduating class. I then, we'd been working on the farm. I was involved in 4-H. Mom and Dad were farms, doing all sorts of things. And I'm starting to get lost as to where I am and what I'm supposed to be telling you.
How about what type farm animals and what crops did you take care of?
Primarily the animals. There was a lot of pasture and with sheep. We had cows and we milked cows. We sold cream. We had chickens. We sold eggs, and we had plenty of all that sort of thing for our own use. The crops were wheat, oats, hay, barley, and it was a rotation thing because you never put the same crop back on the same field. We used to have in the first harvester, we used to harvest, we had to sack and sow the sacks and dump them and pick them up, and we ended up migrating into bulk handling. My 4-H project was sheep, and I grew up with my project doing that.
And how long after you left high school before you got interested in a Navy career?
Well,
or at least a semi-career.
Some of that really started before the war started, because I had on my grandmother's side an aunt had a son who was a pilot in the Navy, and he was in the reserve, and he was interested in being the oldest Navy pilot. Lived down in the Berkeley area of California, and we would, on visitations, talk about that. And then World War II came, and my brother enlisted 2 years, in 1943, and he was in the Navy, and I had 5 cousins. One of them was a chief warrant electrician in the Navy, and then I had a cousin who was a Marine on Iwo Jima, and I had Army. So we had a mix, and all of my older cousins were in the service, and so I decided I was county all-star with the 4-H. In 1944, I was in junior college, and I went down. The group of us in each county, a boy and a girl, were picked, and they got to go to the state convention in Berkeley, and we were at the University of California, and I sneaked over and went to the recruiting office in San Francisco, took the test. I'd been planning it because I'd heard that during the examinations, if you were interested in aviation, which I was at the time, aviations and submarines for some reason, I understood that they flunked them for depth perception failure. So I had gone to an eye doctor while I was in school, and he gave me a series of tests, and for several months I was going through that to be sure that I would pass the depth perception. I went, took the exam, passed, got all the papers, and then came home and broke the news to Mom and Dad of what I had done.
Did they check you for color blindness also?
Oh yes, oh yes. Unfortunately, I've never had that as a problem.
Good.
Oh yes. Seems like every Navy exam I ever had was checked for color.
You got to know the green and red lights.
You sure do. The 6s and 9s. But anyway, so then they said fine. Mom and Dad signed the papers, and this was in the spring of 44, and July 1st of 44, I was still 17 then. I reported to the University of California as an apprentice seaman V12 put an apostrophe and A in those days for aviation, with the intention that I would finish the semester and then go to pre-flight. End of that semester, that never happened because changes in the world situation and the war situation changed enough that they gave me the choice of transferring to the NROTC, which Admiral Nimitz had been one of the commanding officers in his previous career. And so I enjoyed that, and I decided, well, if I worked hard enough, took some extra units in addition to naval science, which I was required to do, I could get my degree and graduate and be commissioned by the time I was 20, and I did. So
that was quite an accomplishment.
Well, I was just caught up in it, and I enjoyed it. Yeah, it was a good regimen for a farm boy who was kind of naive about a lot of things.
Of course, you were used to working long hours too, right?
Had no problem. We'd take the PT exams and stuff, because they were pretty rigid on the exercise issues, and we'd do sit-ups. And this little farm boy who was so thin, it made when I go swimming, they swear that everybody can float. Well, this guy couldn't float.
No body mass.
No body mass. I would sink. But I'd get up there and do sit-ups, and I could do 20, 30, never bat an eye in it. The rest of the group was struggling about 5. Yeah. So anyway, I got started, and I'm in school during World War II.
And what was your first ship assignment?
We graduated in May, June of 46. The war was over in 45, thanks to the Nagasaki bombing, August 9th of 45, and the subsequent surrender. I was assigned to a carrier that was named after one of the great battles of World War II, the USS Tarawa, CV-40. She was a late Essex class. Essex started, as I remember, 27,000 tons. We were up to 37,500, and I reported as an ensign in San Diego, California. And that was my first ship.
And your first job aboard that ship?
In the gunnery department, I'm aboard, and they were so thin on officers, they put me as junior officer in charge of the 1st and 3rd Division gunnery. Now that took care of all the 5-inch guns. We had the 1st Division had the forward 5-inch, and the 3rd Division had the aft. And that also meant that I had to run on a carrier as long as it is, learn the ship from the forecastle to the fantail. And so I had that kind of coverage, and then subsequently I got assigned to the 4th Division as a division officer, and then had to learn the 40 millimeters.
Did you get any formal training on the gunnery, from the gunnery's aspect, school-type training?
No school type off of the ship. During school time, back at Cal, we had Point Montera, in the San Francisco Peninsula, had a small coastal battery, a 5-inch, and we went over one night to do some exercises. But I did live firing until I was on board, and all the training I got, and it was pretty tedious. We had a taskmaster of a captain by the name of A.I. Malmstrom. And every time the aircraft would take off, it seemed, we would get up for a dawn alert or something and would go to quarters. And every time there was an excuse for doing any kind of a drill, oh yes, we got training, but it was on board. And we did live firing on board, firing to sleep.
Yes.
Yeah. But we were sent out from San Diego, and our mission was everybody coming home. They needed Westpac, as we call it. We needed ships out there and people. And so we went from San Diego to Hawaii to Guam and Saipan.
These were Western Pacific deployments.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm familiar with those myself.
I'm sure you are in different ways.
Yeah.
But yeah, we went into the Marianas in particular. We learned how to maneuver around a hurricane down off of Guam. Ypres Harbor had just been built to breakwater, and we came back in. The storm was violent enough that it destroyed the breakwater. And then we operated up to Okinawa, Japan, several of the ports there, and even a year later, Sasebo, the harbor, thick with oil still. We had to clean the strainers of the motor whaleboat by the time we got into port because we were anchored out. And we went to Tsingtao in China and Shanghai. So we did some China service.
What was your next ship assignment?
Well, by all of this time of my tour on the Pickerel, it was time to come home because I was toying with the idea of making a career out of the Navy, and or not. And an event occurred. I had applied for a school, and one of the Academy graduates got the school, and I was upset, and so I said, I'm not going to stay in the regular Navy. I'll go home. And so this is 47. I came home and decided to look for a job. And so I did that, and in the meantime, I pretty well made a commitment to myself. Since the Navy had sent me to school, I owed something. So I joined the active reserve, and I enlisted in a reserve division that was meeting on Treasure Island in San Francisco at the time, until I met an acquaintance who was World War II submarine, Vern Crosby, and later Ed Welch, that I'd gone to school with, and they were both very much active in the submarine service and came back and finished college, and they were there my last year of college. I met them on the street, and they said, why don't you get into submarines? And I loved it.
Go back you mentioned Pickerel, and Pickerel, of course, set some really astonishing records, namely that emergency surfacing at about a 40-degree or 45-degree angle, which then caused that submarine to slip down the path it had just traversed to get where it was above the surface of the water. Were you on board for that?
Well, that was later. I had my reserve. I started in the submarine reserve, got qualified, went to the Pickerel because 6 months after I was married, I got this comeback for Korea. And I was assigned to the Pickerel, and absolutely I was on board. I was PIO officer that day, that time, and yes, I was. And they claimed that the up angle that was taken because we had another submarine, the Sabalo, was off all rigged. This was a planned effort.
For photographs?
C.B. Momsen was comm sub pack at the time. Sub Lent had a good picture of a nice submarine leaping out of the water. Momsen wanted a better one. We gave him a better one. But But when we came out of the water, we didn't sink back as far as most people felt we did, because we had started at 100 feet. We went to what we call the half-hour rate on the batteries, which means that you'll run it until the temperature gets too high. And we also blew all the ballast.
Not just the forward.
No, not just the forward. We blew all the ballast and used the planes to hold us down until the buoyancy was such that we couldn't keep the depth. And once that started, then we went to a change on the planes to get the maximum up angle. But we had full power driving, so we had everything that we could put out, and we came leaping out of the water. And then we did settle a little bit, but it was kind of just a mushy, let the bow fall down. And
You never felt like you were at risk because of the steepness of the recovery action?
somehow I never worried about that sort of stuff. I mean, it was just something you did. But yeah, it was exciting. Yeah. One of our crew members decided he didn't want to take the chance because there was a certain nervousness, and we did a lot of preparation for it.
You mentioned taking the battery electrolyte levels down to a minimum so you wouldn't get splashover.
Absolutely. We wanted to be very careful about that in particular.
And that could, in a diesel boat, that could cause an awful lot of trouble.
Big time.
Yeah.
Yes, big time. Yeah.
Very good.
So,
back to your normal schedule now, back where you left off before we picked up pickerel again. So where did you go after the war was over and you were back in almost civilian community again?
well, that was
San
when
Francisco,
I came
right?
back, decided that I was going to, first I thought I'd go to school and then I'd get a master's degree, and then I just had a cousin who was in the oil business with Union Oil, and I went knocking on doors, and then Shell Oil Company sent me a telegram after the interview and saying if I wanted a job, come see them, and I did. And I went and started work in San Francisco. And then I joined at the same time the Naval Reserve unit, got into the submarine unit, which met on the Alameda Estuary at the training center, got into submarines and was active in that unit. And then I got married while I was in that unit. And I was very active, particularly as training officer with that unit, and stayed with that unit, got my notice. That was when I went back during Korea on the Pickerel for the 2 years. And then when I finished that tour of duty, I came home. I was married then. My first child was born in Hawaii while we were on duty doing odds and ends for the Navy out of Pearl. Came back and went into the unit again because I enjoyed it. And
Did you earn your gold dolphins by that time?
I did indeed. I did indeed. And I had a unique thing. I'm one of the few people that never went to New London Naval Submarine School.
You got all your experience through the School of Hard Knocks.
I got it through the training program that I was involved in the Naval Reserve. Did a pretty good job of getting me started. And Hunters Point at that time was still a Navy base, and it had a little bit of a facility, and they were able to, they had a pressure or chamber so that you could learn how to handle, test you for how you could handle the compression.
Did they put you through the escape process?
Not there.
Not
I never
there.
did that until I was at Pearl.
At Pearl?
Yeah.
In the tank at
In the
Pearl?
tank at Pearl. Yeah.
Did you wear the stanky hoods? Sometimes called the stinky hoods?
No. Momsen.
Momsen?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
The stanky was a later
Yes, it was.
manifestation of the Momsen law.
Oh yeah. Just during the period I'm on the Pickerel, we did a lot of things. I mentioned to you you were in nuclear. You had automatic depth control,
Right.
and we had the very first experimental one.
Which we inherited from you, actually.
Well, actually, because it was evolving, and that was all part of the planning. And one of the other fun things that we did was we went down to Lahaina Roads, and they were experimenting because the torpedoes at the beginning of World War II was pretty lousy. The Japanese had good ones and we didn't. But we were firing acoustic torpedoes to hit. They take the charge out, but they actually did hit. We became very proficient in how to change the propellers on our submarine and go in and out of an ARD, which is a floating dry dock.
Right.
And one day we had one of the hits and we surfaced, and somehow in the surfacing the exercise torpedo ended up on the top of the shears, right by stacked against where the periscope comes up and all of that.
If you tried to do that, you'd never be able to do it.
You couldn't. So, but it was goosey when you know you're being hit.
Yes.
And you're hit pretty hard
Fortunately, it was
on your propellers.
a non-lethal torpedo.
Very.
Yeah.
But at least it was nice to know they worked.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those were some of the fun things. But then back in the unit, I stayed in the unit, and for the second time we won the honors for the area for our submarine division. But this time we won the national competition that Admiral Nimitz was named after. It was called the Nimitz Trophy for the best reserve submarine division. And I was training officer, and I was very pleased with that accomplishment. And what made it even special, I was in a university club, had a membership, and I was able to arrange to have Admiral Nimitz join us for dinner in our wardroom, and then have him be the speaker presenting the award of the trophy that was named after him for our division.
That was a fortunate
And that was one of my highlights.
happenstances.
Yes, it was, because he was always been one of my naval heroes. Yeah, especially since he's one of the few naval officers I know of that ran a ship aground and got away with it.
Did you ever fire any live war shots at Kahulawi, the target rock?
I know the rock.
Yeah.
And they don't let us do that anymore.
No.
But no, we didn't. I never fired a live shot, but for qualification, yes, I did. I did get an MOT.
Did you have an MOT as middle of target?
That's
for
right.
Our audience that may not know that term. Did you have to do a qualification notebook?
Oh yes, the whole process for I had to fill out a notebook. I had to sketch every system. I had to know them.
Trace every system hand over hand through oily bilges.
We had to do everything.
Okay.
Sketch it, keep the note. Somewhere I can still find that darn notebook. In fact, is one of the things my engineering officer, when I did a sketch of the snorkel system, because we didn't have one for the boat, one of our shipyard time periods at Pearl, he had it laminated, expanded, laminated, and use it for a training device on board to
So you created the boat training device?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, did that. But we had, for my qualification, the first thing is we had an import test, and it was a written test given by another commanding officer. Second stage then was to have an import exam by a submarine commanding officer, not mine, which meant that, you've been through this, we'd start on the day and we'd get on the fantail of the ship, and he'd look at something and ask me a question that would kind of boil down to, what's that? Why is it there? What's it do? How does it work? Show me.
Tell me or show me.
Show me. And if you're in port, you'd do that. And we went through the entire boat, stem to stern, doing that.
Including starting up an oil purifier?
Everything.
Starting up a diesel?
No, we didn't do that in port. We did that during underway.
Underway training.
So the qualification underway meant that you went out for 2 days. You get the ship underway, the boat, we call them, get it underway, go through some emergency drills that you had to handle while you were on watch, depending on where you were, and you would also walk through the boat all over again, and then you would do more operational, which meant start engines, do anything he wanted to do on any piece of equipment, including handling the controllers in the maneuvering room for the electric power to the generators.
Mhm.
I mean, from the generators to the batteries and to the engine. I mean, to the
To
power.
the motors,
To
the
the
drive
motors,
motors.
right. Then we kept going, and we had a firing exercise. We had another target ship ranged, and we had to do an approach and a torpedo exercise, and that's when we got to we had to prepare the torpedo. Had a darn good torpedo man. It was a big help, but we had to do it ourselves.
Mhm.
Then we shot that, and then we went into Lahaina, and we anchored, and I almost lost it there. Thank goodness for a chief of the boat.
How did you almost lose it?
Well, I let the anchor go, and I forgot to give the command to stop it. And you know, if you lose an anchor in the Navy, you had it.
Don't feel bad. I lost one too.
Okay, but that's a humorous moment for me, and thank goodness that the chief had enough good sense to stop the anchor. We were fortunately, and not too. That's why we were exercising for the torpedo firing exercise, because of the depth. But we were off of Lahaina roads and did that, and so then bring the ship back in. So we went through all the exercises, and then wait for the. And that was the division commander that was on board doing that.
Right.
Yeah.
So how did you end up finishing your career with the Navy as a reserve officer?
Well, I came back there, and of course, I have a dual career. I full-time job with Shell Oil Company, which I kind of liked what Winston Churchill said about Naval Reserve. He says, twice a citizen. But I enjoyed it, and I still felt there was a lot of give back. And I moved from the Alameda area because of the company to Arizona, and I still went to the training center to see what was available, and you do that, and so you go into non-pay status because it wasn't always for pay. And I joined a unit there, and it was a mobilization team, was the only thing they had then. And it was a time when mobilization planning was important.
Mhm.
And so I joined the mobilization team, and a couple of years later, I nominated for and was commanding officer of that unit. About a year after I was in command of that unit, Shell decided they needed to move me, and so they moved me to Santa Monica, and I joined a Los Angeles mobilization team over there, which was a large one. We were a medium one. So I was executive. They had a spot for me, and so I was an executive officer. About that time, they were still planning that they needed more mobilization teams, and they wanted to activate a new unit in Santa Monica, which was closer to where I worked and lived.
Just from a philosophy standpoint, after the war, it seemed like an awful lot of people bailed out of whatever assignments they had because they wanted to come home and make a life for themselves in the civilian world. What was the impetus for all these mobilization teams?
Readiness.
Readiness.
And actually, they surprised me because a lot of the mobilization that had been going on in this last number of years, when they first started really getting into it and changing the character of the Naval Reserve from a strategic reserve to an operational reserve, which is ongoing right now, they found in some of this activation that people weren't physically ready and all that sort of thing.
And professionally not ready.
No. And that troubled me because the time I was coming up and the kind of training I was getting and giving, we were ready, and we had to have an annual physical exam, and yes, we had to do the PT kind of stuff, because that came later because they were finding that it was getting not as ready as it should be. And I still haven't figured out how things got slipped, but in the era that I'm doing with mobilization, we were planning for a need during the Cold War of being able to set up an operation with doctors and the whole 9 yards and be absolutely quickly able in our area to process people immediately to active duty.
Well, it seems like the warfare skills, they sort of tail off very rapidly if you're not
Yep.
training almost every month,
Mhm.
every week. And you can't have a mobilization unit if you don't keep training. I mean, it's got to be driven into people, and they lose that capability very quickly if they're not enmeshed in it.
Yes, that was one of the reasons, and particularly as I moved from the mobilization group, and then another move to New Jersey. I was working in New Jersey at the time. I went into a surface division there, which I was glad to get back into that. But I didn't like the paperwork that much, which a mobilization team was a lot of that.
Mhm.
But you had a surface division, and I was glad to take the surface division. They used to meet once a week, and I was very instrumental in our submarine division to getting us to meet once a month for a weekend, a full weekend, where you could really spend some time and concentrate on good training. And so I got our reserve division after I was there a while in a non-pay status, and I got a pay status, and then I became commanding officer of that division and had the authority, and I converted it to a weekend unit, which went quite well.
Did you make captain by this time?
Not quite. I was a commander then. At the end of my tour with the surface division, I made captain just when I was leaving and being transferred to Atlanta. But one of the fun things I had with this division was converting it to weekends. We went Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. We'd go down there and we would offer our services with our skills to the shipyard to have our people, based upon their ratings, work in the shipyard for the weekend.
Mm.
And that helped.
How many people were in that unit at the time?
80.
80?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So that was 80 gratis people to provide labor for a weekend.
Yeoman, radioman, machinist, the whole 9 yards.
Mm.
But then one weekend I was able to convince the skipper of a reserve minesweeper out of Atlantic City to let us take my crew and take it under my command and run from Atlantic City down to Cape May, which was a Coast Guard base.
Mm-hmm.
I went down, spent the night, RON in Cape May, and turned right around and came back the next day, and that was a Saturday, Sunday. We had a good weekend. We did everything, and it was my crew. And that's what the Navy is for, in my book. The Navy is to go to sea on ships, and that's what the Navy's about. I believe that then, I believe it now.
I agree with you wholeheartedly.
Yeah. So then I finished that tour. I had 2 years with that division, and as commanding officer, and then I went to Atlanta. I had started a boy, my 4 children, 2 boys. My oldest boy was just starting to get to a stage he needed more of his dad, and we started him in Scouts, and the Naval Reserve and Scouting and my involvement was in conflict. Mm-hmm. I had just made captain. I just get transferred by my company to Atlanta. I get my son into a scout program, and I decided, I went to the training center and I had a couple of meetings, but I said I can't do both, and so I switched and I became an assistant scoutmaster. And that was when I stopped being active, and a few years later I finally went to retired status because I felt that I would be holding up a billet available in the table of organization for the Naval Reserve, and somebody else needed it. I wasn't really going to exercise it. Yes, I would have liked to try to keep going, but I felt that my children were important.
I think that was a good decision. You switched from blue to green, right?
Yep. Yep.
That's great. Well, Len, it's been awfully nice talking with you and hearing your story, and it sounds like you had a really exciting career.
I really did. I feel I owe the Navy more than I gave it. It gave me a college education. It paid me to go to school. $50 a month was pretty good in those days. And then it was $200 a month when I first became an ensign. But my reserve training duties, the 2 weeks every year, and I faithfully made those all the way through every year. They were all good. Some of them were at sea. I enjoyed my first 2 weeks on a submarine, the Diadon, then the Pomadon. I went out on a cruiser, the St. Paul. I went on my last, one of my last ship training duties was on a carrier because my nostalgia took me back there. It was out of Long Beach. But I had some educational courses too. So in the correspondence courses that I was required to take and did take, they were all helpful in my learning. Because this farm boy, I did well in high school, I did well in college, but I was still a very socially naive young man from the country. And sometimes I still think I am.
Well, it seemed to work wonders for you, though. You made a nice career out of it.
Thanks to the gal that I married, too. She put up with it, yes.
All right.
Thank you.
Good job.